Hey everybody! So this is another bonus episode thanks to the folks who are donating to the podcast, whether that be through Patreon, which is patreon.com/thefatsquirrel, or via the blog at thefatsquirrel.com, where you can find a donate button via PayPal. But this is another bonus episode, and this one is all going to be about apple butter. So September is high apple season here. Definitely we have apples available in Indianapolis, which is where I am, central Indiana, which is just south of the Great Lakes, if you are not familiar with U.S. geography. So our apple season runs from late July all the way up through basically early November. But depending on what you want to pick, earlier in the season are usually not the greatest keeping apples. So for example, today we're going to work with Cortland Apples, which are a hybrid developed by McIntosh and Ben Davis in 1898. And they are similar to a McIntosh actually, but they are a little bit less complicated in their flavor. And they're very juicy, so they do really well for sauces and things like that. So you can find that information in Apples by Roger Yepsen, right? Because I totally have that on my shelf. That's not a library book. So again, Cortlands are not the greatest keeping apple. I do enjoy eating them. They are tartar apple than like your grocery store eating apples, like Yellow Delicious and those kinds of things. And they are a little bit softer than my favorite textured apples. However, they do have a thin skin. So if you have trouble with apple skins bothering your teeth or gums, they're a good option. But they are not the greatest keeping apple. You'll get better keeping apples later in the season. But so this is a good time to use these. We picked, unfortunately, an entire bushel that's almost entirely Cortlands. There were a few Jonathans that we snuck. They weren't technically ready. There were a few Jonathans that we snuck in there, and a few ginger golds, which are not my favorite, but they're fine for eating until my more desirable apples come on the trees. So, yes, apple butter. So, I did a bunch of research determining what we should use for the apple butter recipe. And these are all my personal books. They're not library books, unfortunately, because I have problems. They're not all about apples. Only 2 of them are exclusively about apples. I mean, I'm not that crazy, y'all. Fairly crazy. But there seem to be basically 3 schools of apple butter making. One of them is, they all have a very similar processing method. The difference is in your preparation of your apples. So, if you look online, for example, for apple butter recipes, you will see recipes that involve you, like the most popular, like All Recipes or one of those big clearinghouse websites, their most popular apple butter recipe calls for you to peel, quarter, and core your apples. So basically, take them down like you're making applesauce almost. And then another school of apple butter making has you just core and quarter the apples, so you leave the peels on. And then the third school is you just take off the stem and quarter them. So you leave the full apple intact with core and seeds and everything, just remove the stem. So there are different reasons why you might do any one of those things. If you do not have a food mill, you probably do not want, or a food sieve or whatever you would like to use. But you probably don't want to use the one where you're leaving the cores in, because you do need to take the seeds and the most fibrous bits of the apple core out before you can the apple butter or store it, however you're going to decide to do that. So the great thing about doing the recipes that just involve you, peel, quartering, and coring the apples, is that you don't have to use a food mill at all. And in fact, you don't even technically have to use a blender, because they will cook down, especially depending on the kind of apple. So let me clarify that. If you use a later season, firmer fleshed apple, or like a Granny Smith, or whatever you think of as a more traditional baking apple, an apple that holds its shape more, you might not be able to get away with just cooking it down. You might need to use like an immersion blender or a blender to smooth out the texture if that's what you want. Usually if I am using it as a condiment, like a jam, I do want a smoother texture. But if you're using it primarily to cook with, then the texture doesn't really, sometimes the added texture is a good thing. So that's one of the reasons you might use a recipe where you remove peels and core, the apple. And some people do not remove the core, some people remove the core but not the peels. And in fact, that's the way Ball recommends you do it. That is the way, actually I think putting food by, and putting food by, which are kind of like the two. Putting food by is by Janet Green, Ruth Hertzberg, and Beatrice Vaughn. Those are kind of like the two biblical tomes of canning. And so both of those have you remove cores. Okay. And in fact, Let's Preserve It, which is a book by Beryl Wood, which is like the English, or one of the English resources for preserving, actually differentiates apple butter, American style, which is where you peel, quarter, and core, versus apple cheese, which is where you just quarter the apple. So you're leaving the peel and the core in to make the apple butter. What is the actual difference? I think you can tell by the name, right? Like butter versus cheese. I think when you leave the core in, it gets a slightly thicker product because the core has a lot of pectin in it. I was concerned the first time I heard about leaving the cores in that the arsenic, or it's arsenic in apple seeds, right? Would be, and that's not an issue. It doesn't cook down that much to produce any sort of toxicity levels. So it's just your own call. Last time I made it with the cores. I just left the cores and the peels in. And it's amazing how much of that just disintegrates in the butter. And like when you run it through a food mill, you'll be shocked at how little actually did not work into the butter. And also, I'm saying butter a lot. Apple butter does not involve any butter. It's not like a curd or something or anything like that that incorporates a animal product. It is a vegan, right? Yeah, it's a vegan product. Suddenly I was like, wait, what? So it's just, the butter is referring, I think, just to the texture or the fact that it is the distillation of the apple itself. So there's that one. And then there's kind of, so once you decide how you're going to process your apples in terms of, are you going to take cores out? Are you going to take peels off? What are you going to do? Then you need to decide how you're actually going to cook the apple butter down. And there's three ways you can do it. You can do it on the stovetop, but you have to be super duper vigilant, like very, very vigilant, because it gets so thick in consistency that it scorches very easily. And again, it has a high sugar content. For example, in the Apple Lovers Cookbook, which is by Amy Traverso, which was a gift from a viewer, thank you. And you'll see this in other places too online. She does an overnight apple butter, which essentially involves you cooking the apples down, running them through the food mill, or again, mashing them, whatever you decide to do with what you've put into the apple. And then you cook it in a, what's that thing called? A slow cooker. Sorry, I couldn't think of what it was called. Then you cook it in a slow cooker overnight, like with the lid cracked, to get the evaporation. So some people might ask, like, well, can I do this in an Instapot? Can I do this? The issue is you're wanting to cook it for evaporation, right? You're caramelizing the sugars further, yes, but you need evaporation. And so that's the reason you cook it in a slow cooker with the lid cracked or slightly off, so that you do get that seam escaping. You don't want that condensation to roll off the top of the lid and go back down into the butter. You want to get rid of that condensation. So you'll see recipes that do that. This one, for example, gives you either option to either bake it at 350 or to do it in a slow cooker. It's up to you what you would prefer. Then you'll also see differences. And that is a recipe from Preserving the Harvest by Carol Kostenbotter. That's totally a guess. If you don't like sugar, if you're not wanting to use sugar, I talked a little bit about in the candied jalapenos, that sugar is a preservative in terms of it preserves flavor, color, and texture. So texture is not such a big issue, but certainly color and flavor are good if you were not going to use this within 6 months, like if you want to have it storing on the shelf for over a year, or if you're giving it to people who you don't know if they'll use it right away. So there is sugar in most apple butter recipes that are being canned. But if you're interested in doing one without sugar, you don't really have to use sugar, because depending on the apple you use, you get a good sweet flavor. But you can also use them with dates. This is in a book, Naturally Sweet Food in Jars by Marissa McClellan, who is kind of like a modern preserver. And so she does one with dates instead of a sugar. And she also uses cider vinegar, which you'll see in some recipes. Some recipes have you use just lemon juice. Some have you use no acidic liquid. Some have you use apple cider vinegar, some both. It just depends. You just have to decide what you want to do. And then, yeah. Okay, I think that's all. Here's another recipe from Put 'em Up, which is a good general purpose jam, like preservation. It has not just fruit jams, but also, you'll see the next section is on asparagus, has vegetables. So it's a good resource as well. I guess I chose this one because it has bottled lemon juice and such. And you'll also see a huge variation in sugar quantities. And that is because, of course, the sugars in your apples are going to vary quite a bit. Essentially, you're doing it to taste. Most books recommend, or most recipes recommend, a cup of sugar to a pound of apples. Some of them will have you do measure the pulp out after it cooks down the first time. It just depends, but it just, whatever works for you is basically seems to be the kind of common consensus. And then the last resource is Marilyn Kluger's Preserving Summer's Bounty. And this is an old book, but you can get it in a used bookstore for pretty cheap. I think this was like $1. But I wanted to show you this one because it's awesome, because not only, see, this is a kind of an older school recipe book, right? Where you get not just the recipe, you get like an Elizabeth Zimmerman recipe. Like these are the pithy recipes for canning, right? So you not only get kind of like a less formalized version of a recipe, you also get a great accompanying narrative about her family and what their processes were for doing these things, making apple butter or whatever. And she has a recipe, which I think you definitely need, for open kettle apple butter, which involves not only reducing 10 gallons of apple cider by half, but then incorporating 4 bushels of apples. That is a big kettle, y'all. I think my mom's church actually used to do this. They had big, essentially cauldrons where they would do this. I don't know if it was on that scale or not. But if you don't understand, if you're not familiar, a bushel of apples weighs like 40 pounds, and it's a lot of apples. So 40 pounds times 4 is 160 pounds, and then 5 pounds of sugar per bushel. How crazy is that? I totally dig it. But then she also talks about how her mother used to make it with Red Hots, which I thought was pretty cute. So her mother would make apple butter with Red Hots, which I'm sure would give it a nice rosy color. But, so yeah, isn't that fun? So I highly recommend this. This is, again, Marilyn Kluger's Preserving Summer's Bounty. I feel like it's this is a 70s. Yeah. Original copyright was 71. So it's kind of like, oh shoot, what was his name? Oh, crud. There was a PBS show when I was a kid, and I have some of his cookbooks. The Budget Gourmet guy. Anyway, I can't think of it right now. But it kind of reminds me of that. Again, cookbooks have really changed a lot in 50 years. Oh my gosh, that's so long. Okay. In 50 years, we've gone from these, again, these more not all cookbooks from the 70s were this narrative, but we've gone from a much more narrative approach. And again, sort of pithy. Like most people are like, oh, canning, it needs to be so precise. She's like, just add the spices to your taste, you know. So we've gone from that to these like super glossy, well, this one's not actually glossy, but these very like highly produced, super attractive, and often highly glossy cookbooks, which is kind of fun. I just enjoy cookbooks so much. They're fascinating. Anyway, so what am I going to use? I haven't decided yet. I think what I've learned is, yeah, just swing it, pretty much. Yeah. Oh, also, to further confuse things and complicate matters, when you're actually doing, these I will preserve using a hot water bath. And the hot water bath processing times in all of these resources vary anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. That's actually significantly different, y'all. So I'll probably shoot for the middle and go for 10, but I just thought it was interesting. So anyway, so I'm going to clear these all away and then we'll start on making apple butter. Okay, so I think what I've decided on is to go with putting food by, which is again kind of like a universal recipe or universal resource. So you should be able to get this at your local library or whatever. And so I'm going to use their recipe. And essentially I like the proportion of sugar to apples. And I think what I'm going to do this time is core my apples. Last time my apple butter was a little bit, I want to say waxy is too strong of a word, but it definitely had some element of waxiness to it. And I wonder if that is because of maybe a slightly too much pectin in the butter for my personal taste. So I think what I'm going to do today, even though it pains me to actually core them because it is so satisfying to cook them down and just have that teensy little bit left. I think I will go ahead and core them today. Frugality is very exciting, y'all. Okay. So, and again, I don't think there's an issue with copyright or anything like this because essentially I won't use this exactly anyway. And there are a million varieties of this recipe that are all relatively the same. They just have different elements to them. So, but I just wanted to pick something that, you know, you could get access to through your local library. Or again, this is a great resource just in general. It has everything from canning fruits and vegetables to pickling, curing with salt and smoke, drying, root cellaring. So it's a great resource if you are interested in learning more about preserving food. So I'm going to use this handy dandy, this one is from Kaufland. I don't know how you say that. But it's just going to take the core out of my apples and cut them at the same time. So it saves me a little bit of work, although it's a pain to take that little apple core out. So basically I'm going to do that with all my apples. I'm going to do about a half bushel today. So I'm doing about 20, not quite 20 pounds. And so unlike jam, it is okay to, jams you usually do not want to multiply the recipe because they are, to get them to boil and get things like that going, if you double or triple or whatever the recipe, it really can affect that and make the jam cook longer than it has to, which can take away some of your flavor. And just remove any blemishes as you're going. You don't need to worry about russeting, which is like the, none of these have a lot of russeting on them, well, this is the beginning of russeting. That's where the apple gets kind of brown and the texture gets really rough, almost like dry skin or something. And that is just a natural element of many apples. It's not something that makes the apple bad at all. But when you are doing you pick, and the nice thing is too, sometimes I miss the some of the core in this. I'm not going to worry about that because, again, last time I made it with the entire core in. What you do want to worry about with U-Pick is blemishes. And see this? That's a wormhole. Now, you're like, oh, worm. It's not really, I don't care about the worm in the apple because usually they're not actually in there. But if they are and you store these apples, that worm is such a greedy bugger. He will go into every apple in your entire into your entire storage area and eat out of each and every one of them. Okay, maybe it's not one apple. Maybe it's not one worm. Maybe he has worm babies. I don't know. But he is not your Richard Smalley Dudley worm dude. Whatever his name was. What was his name? It's probably not even Richard Smalley. But so you can see it's just very superficial. And you can cut that out. I don't even necessarily think you have to. The main thing though is that's fine when you're doing applesauce, but not when you're storing your apples. So if you're picking apples in October to store, you have to be super careful about that. And sometimes on the russeting apples, it is kind of hard to tell the difference between that russety patch and a wormhole. But you have to remain vigilant. Vigilant. Especially if your family are like mine and feel like they have to give homes to the orphan apples. Does your family do that? Do you do that? You can't pick apples with me. You're an animal. And so really taking the core out doesn't take that much longer than just taking the stem out and cutting them up. And of course, this is cutting them into what? Eighths, which is fine. Quarters, eighths, whatever. Actually, I may not do this full 18 pounds because I may not be able to get them all into a pan. We'll see. I may have to cook them down like to the sauce stage and then run them through the food mill and then actually do them in the dehydration phase in one batch. Like do applesauce, multiple batches. And then actually cook them down separately. And if you want to make applesauce, I highly recommend it. Okay, so one thing I always like to think about when I'm doing apple stuff, which I don't know, I find endlessly fascinating. And if you're new to the podcast, I really like apples. If you're returning to the podcast, you're like, oh my gosh, shut up. But let's see, how many... Okay, so for example, this apple has, what, 4 seeds? Is that standard? No, because this guy has a double chamber, so he has more. But let's just say even they only had 4 seeds. Because there are 4 chambers. But lots of times the chambers have two seeds in them. But sometimes they only have 1. But let's just say there's only 4 seeds in each one of these. See, how many do we have? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28. What is that? 80, 112 minimum different apple trees will grow out of this because they're not consistent. You have to get an apple. This Cortland is supposed to be genetically the same as the variety that was developed in 1898 or whatever I said it was earlier, because you get them by grafting. And apples naturally want to reproduce by sex. Apple sex. So none of these will be the same as its parent. Right? Like how cool is that? Okay, so go ahead and throw it in your compost bin, or if you're special and you have an orchard, make that happen. I don't. And I'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, so here are all my apples. I'm actually going to do 15 pounds. So there's 15 pounds of apples in here. Well, 15 pounds of finished. That's not counting the cores. But 15 pounds of finished apples in there. And then I'm basically tripling those ratios. But the water is the only thing you're going to add right now, unless you're using the apple cider to cook them down in. I just don't have any apple cider on hand. So really the only reason you want water in there is just to prevent the apples from sticking to the bottom of the pan, to create steam, because they'll release their own liquid as well. So I've got my water and my apples, or again, if you're going to use cider, And I'm just gonna cover these and cook them down. If your lid doesn't fit, can you hear that mine's not actually making connection? If your lid doesn't fit, that's fine. They'll cook down in a minute. The lid is mostly, again, so that you don't lose all of that water and to just kind of keep that heat in. So you wanna cook those down, just again, until they're soft enough to be run through a food mill, and then we'll go to the next step. Okay, so I'm cooking my apples down, and thank you, Heidi, yarn hoarder's daughter, made me this super awesome pot holder, which I regularly use. It is made from Harrisville Designs pot holder loops, which are the superiorist. So I have stirred this a couple of times just to break down, just to move the apples around, because the ones that were on the top were not getting as much heat. So I've just, and you can see it is super mashy, right? Like super broken down. And so what I'm going to do now is go ahead and run this mess through the food mill. If you don't have a food mill, if you did take out your cores, you can, if you have a super good blender, you can run it through that, or I mean like a super, it does kale kind of blender. But it also depends on your apple and how tough the skins are. Everything is relative, yo. That's what life is about. The last time I did this, the skins like cooked down to almost, they just disintegrated. Probably used a different variety, but definitely, I will definitely run these through the food mill and get those out. But you can see it's already thickened up quite a bit just from the initial cook, but I'll get the food mill out and show you that, and we'll do that next. Okay, so if this happens to you while you were either doing your apple butter portion, or even if you're doing it where you're just cooking your apples to get them through the food mill, scorch on your pan, right? You turn away for a second and it happens. Usually, this happened to me while I was doing my apples. I walked away too long to do something else because I am a fan of inefficient multitasking. So this happened when I was just cooking them down. And so I did not lose all the apples. I just left the most of the scorch. I kept tasting around them to make sure they didn't have the flavor of being scorched. But I think, you know, usually if you don't stir that stuff in, like if you can tell when you start to stir that there's something going on, just don't vigorously stir it in and just take the apples off the top. And then I just lost a little bit around here, but the rest of them do not taste scorched at all. So, but what you can do to get rid of this, because this is pretty much beyond elbow grease. This is like a carbonized mess right now. If you boil this water, or boil this pan with a few tablespoons of baking soda in it, with water, excuse me, water, a few tablespoons of baking soda, you know, where you don't have to boil the whole thing full of water if you've only got scorch on the bottom, but you want to give yourself a good amount of water, and a couple tablespoons of baking soda. It will help to loosen that up for you. So, random tip that might come in handy. So here's my cast iron after I sent it through, did the baking soda trick with it. As you can see, it's nice and clean again. There is one little dot here. I don't know if you can see that. That's actually a pock in my enamel. That's not what's that's not left over from the scorch. But yeah, just 4 cups of water or whatever you need to cover the stain. Put it in, or put it on medium heat. Bring it to a simmer. Put a few tablespoons of baking soda in there, and then let it simmer for like 3 or 4 minutes, and then just use a wooden spoon to scrape. Don't use metal, use a wooden spoon to scrape off the carbonized bits, the dark brown bits, and they will totally lift off. It takes a little bit of elbow grease depending on how bad your scorch is. Mine was pretty gnarly, so it did take a good amount of elbow grease, but that's all you have to do, and then just rinse it out, dry it out, and you're ready to go again. So hooray, hooray. Okay, so the light is changing a bit. I do apologize for that. We're getting a storm that's going to be coming in. So I just be aware that it's not suddenly 10 hours later. It's just getting a little darker. So what I have here is a food mill just over, whatever, bowl, pan, whatever you're gonna do. If you're gonna do it in the slow cooker, just, food mill it right into the slow cooker pan. And a food mill, this one is from OXO. I've had it for, I don't know, a while now. And it's really nice. It folds up, the little legs fold under. And so if the handle folded under, that would be awesome to make a smaller footprint, but I'll handle it. It has, this is what the apples are gonna press through. And so it's basically, what is that called, a chinois? The conical sieve that you use, fine mesh strainer that you use to take pulp out of things, whether it be tomatoes or whatever. So this is just, you can also use this to make mashed potatoes, and it comes in randomly handy in a number of instances. So anyway, so this is the finest strainer that I have for mine. This is number 2, and then number 3 almost looks like a cheese grater. I thought I had it out here, but I must have washed it and put it over there. It's almost like a cheese grater. So they suggest that you use the smallest one. And then this part just fits in here. Woo! And then we'll put the apples in here, and this little paddle basically presses the apples through the sieve. So it does the same thing as a sieve. It's just, or like a fine mesh sieve. That's what we're gonna say. Strainer. But just does it a little bit more efficiently. So I need a measuring cup, and somehow walked away without. Here we go. So you're just gonna scoop this stuff up, and you'll find a rhythm to like how much you're gonna put in there versus not. It's totally your deal. And you're just gonna do this, put on some tunes so you can shake it while you're getting your apple puree through there. If you have super picky people in your household and you do not have a immersion blender, this is another way you can do applesauce if they really want the super smooth applesauce. That's weird, but whatever. I have picky people in my house too. I feel you. Fist bump. So you just keep going. And you do this until you process all your stuff through there. If you find that you're spinning and you're not getting any apple mush out of the bottom, it is possible that you have enough peel that you're blocking. That's fine. Just take it apart, get that peel out of the way, and then go back to it. So I don't think you want to watch me process this entire thing. And I will come back at you when this is done. Okay, so how do you know if you are done with the food mill? Well, you'll see it starts to get this kind of woody, almost not woody is an exaggeration, but it kind of gets, see, like it starts to look very fibrous. Probably a better, and I mean plant fiber, not animal fiber. It starts to look very fibrous, and when you turn the crank, you just start to get very, very little return, or it wants to push everything up. So at that point, you're done. So what I'm going to do, normally I would do this in the oven, but my afternoon kind of got away from me. So I'm actually going to do the overnight crock pot method. So I'll put it in the crock pot overnight. I'll show you that in a minute, and then can it in the morning. Of course, it's the same recipe whether you're doing it in the crock pot or in the oven, or if you're a very brave soul, on the stove. I also imagine you could do this one in the bread maker if your bread machine has a jam cycle, but definitely not in this large of a quantity because I've gone crazy. Okay. But so yeah, I'm gonna get that going. And then, so I wanted to mention that this is a forgiving recipe. Like if you find, in this situation, if you find yourself like, oh no, I don't have enough time to get this done tonight, and you don't want to be my grandmother who would just be like, well, I'll just stay up till midnight and do this. You can totally put it in the refrigerator at this stage and then do it in the oven tomorrow. Not a problem. Because you're going to bring it back up to temperature during that second process anyway, the actual like reduction process. So that is not a problem if you need to take it down and chill it down overnight or whatever. I don't know that I would chill it down for more than a day, but I don't know. I don't know. But I definitely feel comfortable with chilling it overnight or what have you. But I'll just go ahead and try it in the crock pot and see how that goes. So I'm going to get my fixins in and I'll be back with you in just a minute. Okay, so here are my apples after they've gone through the food mill. This at this point is just apples and water, unless you cooked it with cider, in which case you would have cider going in here as well. My slow cooker is 6.5 quarts. And I will have enough to fill it. I didn't put it in right now because I wanted to make mixing easier, but I have some hanging out back there to fill this up with. So I have about 6.5 quarts of applesauce ready to be going into butter, essentially. So since a general rule of thumb is 1/4 cup of sugar to 1 cup of apple mash sauce, whatever, 4 cups and a quart, sorry if you're metric, 4 cups and a quart means a cup of sugar per quart. So this is about 6.5 cups of sugar. Now I'm gonna go ahead and go with 5 and then I'll test it and see how it goes. 2. I hope I don't have to have one bag. 3. 4. Wouldn't it be the best if I ran out of sugar? Oh, almost exactly 5. So there's that. And so we will do cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Now, that's just to your taste. It's your jam. Literally, it's your jam. So I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3 cinnamons, 3 teaspoons of cinnamon, because that's how I'm feeling today. And then I mean, I like cloves, but I'm not a huge clove person. So I'm gonna just do 1/2 a teaspoon of cloves. And then I'm gonna do some nutmeg, but I need to grate it, and now I've just realized that it's not near me. So I'm gonna find that, hopefully, while I'm talking to you. Oh, and my grater's dirty. Oh, I gotta use the rasper, that's fine. People, see, it's really like you're just hanging out with me in the kitchen and cooking, because I am all over the place all the time. My child has hidden the rasp grater. Okay, sorry about that. We are going to go ahead and add in some nutmeg at this point. Again, I really dig nutmeg, but it can be very strong. So the general rule of thumb is 1/2 as much nutmeg, 1/2 as cinnamon, but I probably won't use that much. And you probably don't want to watch me grate nutmeg, which I could probably just scrape my thumb into this at any second. So I will back off and do that, and then, well, let's just mix it up because you're right here with me. You might as well. So just gonna mix that up and then leave it in the slow cooker overnight. Okay, so here we are. All of our spices and sugar are mixed in, and we are ready to start in the slow cooker. So everybody kind of has a different opinion on this, and that's because everybody's apples are different. Everybody's slow cooker is probably slightly different. But general consensus is anywhere from 6 to 10 hours on low. If your apple butter has gone down in temperature, you probably want to put it on a higher setting, or at least leave the lid on for an hour or so just to get it up to a good temp. Because, you know, food milling and all that stuff is going to bring your temperature down on your apples. So get up to a good temp. And then, again, low for 6 to 10 hours. I will leave my lid, I'll put a wooden spoon underneath my lid to just let steam evaporate, or just let steam out of the pot so it doesn't recondense and go down into the apple butter. I wouldn't leave the lid off, because they do cook at such a low temperature that will really affect how hot the apple butter is itself. So again, 6 to 10 hours, and so I'll see you tomorrow morning, and we'll get this stuff canned up. Okay, so here we are the next morning. You can see the jam, or the apple butter, has cooked down a bit. Now also be aware that when I had it full last night, it was actually fuller than this, and then I had another 8 cups in reserve of the apple pulp that I added in this morning. So just so you know, that's why it's not, I mean, it has cooked down considerably more than what it looks like right now. We are having some rainy weather, so I'm holding a light above this so we can see what's going on. So I did last night, I left it on low all night with the lid cracked. But I think in the future what I will do is just start keeping a canning log, because that's important. I made this a few years ago and I've just totally forgotten everything I did. But what I think I'll do in the future is do it like in the morning, or get started early in the morning, and then let this cook on an open slow cooker on high. Because my cooker is on high right now, and as long as I come around every hour or so and stir it, it's not having any tendency to stick. You can see there's like, definitely gunky stuff just where it's overnight kind of bubbled up and dried on there. That's fine. You can scrape that off and put it into the butter. And then I just wanted you to see what it looks like before I stir it, because it does separate out a bit. Like the pulpier stuff will kind of mound up in the middle and you'll get more liquid on the side. So I just wanted you to see that if yours does that. Sometimes it also gets like a little bit of a frothiness to it on the sides. That's totally normal and a-okay. Nothing bad is happening. So what I want to talk about now is how you know if your apple butter is done. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you can tell if your apple butter is ready to be jarred or frozen or whatever you're going to do to it. It's not such an acute situation like jam is, where you need to know instantaneously if it's at the right consistency, because you don't want to overcook it. It's got a lot more wiggle room. So what I usually do is just put some in a little ramekin or on a saucer or whatever, and put it in the refrigerator to cool it down, just till it's about room temperature or a little bit cooler, because usually you're going to serve it out of the refrigerator. So you want the texture to be pleasant to you at that point. So you just do that, and then you just see if you like it. There's no fundamental truth about how it has to be. But I like mine to be able to mound on the jar or mound on the spoon. That's a typical standard, so it doesn't just immediately flatten off or run away. It does maintain a mound, and like you can see probably earlier when I scrape it up off the thing, it'll stay, it goes into the space a little bit. It's not like a hard gel, but it sets pretty well. So to me, this is a good texture, and I am going to go ahead and start my canning process. It's up to you, whatever you would prefer to do. You can just freeze it if you'd like to, or you can do a traditional hot water bath canning setup. The rule of thumb is anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. I will probably go with 10 because my butter is very hot still, and usually you do that with a frozen plate, but this is already chilled. So that's another way you can tell if it, or how you like that way also you can see the color of it. It does turn a very nice amber brown, and very homey and yummy. So what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, hot water bath can. So you do that. My jars are in the oven right now, sanitizing. I don't always sanitize my jars because I'm a bad human, but you can either run them through the dishwasher. Most dishwashers have a sanitized setting. You can put them in the microwave actually for a certain amount of time. I think it's like 45 seconds. Or you can just wash them, put them in the oven for about 20 minutes on 250, and then that will also sanitize them. And one of the nice things about that is it also heats your jars up. It keeps them at a good temperature to put hot jam into. It's just kind of convenient, except having the oven on, which isn't always convenient. But since I'm doing this many jars, it makes sense. So what I'll do now is go ahead and just get those set up. And And just like always, you're just gonna use a funnel to make your life more pleasant. No need to be a crazy person. And I will leave the slow cooker on. That's one of the other nice things about doing this in a slow cooker is I'm gonna have more than one batch of cans. So I can leave this running while I can a set of them, and it'll keep it at a good temperature and ready to go. So you use, for half pints you want a 1/4 inch headspace, and for full pints you want a 1/2 inch. Whoops, that was too much. So if you get too much, don't take the funnel off because it'll just make a mess of your jar, but just scoop some out there and move on. And that's all you do. We're just going to fill those up, put them through the hot water bath, and then I'll show you at the end what we've got. And yeah, I think that's all you need to know. Okay, so then you want to just wipe off your bands. This one is a little bit easier, or excuse me, the lids of the jars, the rims, because you can actually see if you've got dirty rims. But again, just a clean dishcloth, damp is helpful. You don't want it sopping wet because you don't want to get water into your jars. But there is that, and then yeah, we're just going to put 2-part canning lids on them. And then put them in the back. So here we go. Woo! So again, the nice thing about having them in this to do the oven sanitize is that it's very easy to transport them back and forth between where you filled them and the hot water bath area. My band's actually probably not going to fit on. I'll need to take one of these jars out. But go ahead and finger tighten. And finger tighten, by the way, sometimes it just means it shouldn't be loose, like it shouldn't like rattle or anything, but you don't want to like put your arms into it. You don't want to like stretch. You don't want to stretch, that's not right. But you don't want to, you're going to see my tripod leg a little bit, but hopefully that'll give you a better idea. Finger tighten just means only use your fingers. Don't bend your elbow and use the arm leverage. Sometimes it's easy to just tighten them because you're afraid to tighten them too tightly. Now you may have just heard a jar pop. Yeah, one of them did. But I will go ahead and put it through the hot water bath anyway because there's a school of people who just do it that way. They just can that with the heat of the jars. But that makes me a little bit nervous. So I will go ahead and run them through the hot water bath just like a normal. And then that'll be all. Maybe when we come back we can have a piece of toast or something. Okay, so that's apple butter, y'all. This consistently is my favorite way to eat apple butter. Sorry, I'm boring. But apple butter on whole wheat toast is the best. You can do lots of cooking with, like baking with it. You can use it for pork roasts as like a topping on a pork roast or a ham. Quick breads, muffins, cookie bars, all those sorts of things. But I don't have one recipe that I think is just the best to recommend. So if you find something you think is the best, you should totally share with the class. Okay? Okay. But I did just want to show you, I have since cooked applesauce to be canned. I did 20 pounds of apples for sauce as well. So you can just see the difference in the color. They're both Cortlands, but you can see, and they both have cinnamon. They both have a little bit of, this even has a little bit of brown sugar in it instead of the white. I know a lot of people don't use sugar in their applesauce. Yay. But my family does like sugar in their applesauce. Boo. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the color difference so you can see that there. All right, kids. That's all, I think. And we'll be back next time with a regular episode. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, feel free to contribute via Patreon at patreon.com/thefatsquirrel or on the blog site at www.thefatsquirrel.com. Thanks.